Thank you. Thank you very much for the opportunity to try and do a better version of the talk than I did last time. If we treat Oxford as a rehearsal, so this is the real thing, as far as I'm concerned. Women and money. Um, uh, Looking at it from a 19th century perspective, um, and what I'm going to do is, first of all, give a little bit of the background, because obviously the position of women in the 19th century was radically different from what it is now. I'm going to give that perspective, and then look at some examples of women in Trollope's novels, and illustrate a number of different points. What I shall try to do now is share the correct screen. Let me get this up. And so hopefully you now have a title screen which tells me who I am. And so starting with the legal position of women, and it boils down to a concept called couverture, which is in effect the woman's legal position is covered by her husband on marriage. So, as Blackstone describes it, the husband and wife are one person in law. And so basically, whatever the woman has no existence outside of her husband's legal existence, which is kind of a radically different position than we have reached now. And during the course of the 19th century, when Trollope was writing, the position does change. And so I'll be looking at how that position changes. Basically, under this, she had, on marrying, she gave up all of her personal property, and basically her husband could do what he liked with it, including give it away to anybody else, uh, even will it away from her on death. So she could actually find that her property just vanished out of her control completely. And on her husband's death, she ceased to have it or even access to it. Um, there are certain reservations in that. So she retained legal ownership of real property, so that's housing and such. But she had very limited ability to manage or control it. So she couldn't sell it, she couldn't rent it or mortgage it without her husband's consent. So the fact that she actually legally owned it seems to me to make very little difference if she can't do anything she wants with it without her husband say so. And of course, inevitably on divorce, the law offered them no rights to the marital property. So you marry somebody, you give him your property. If you get divorced, and it was not an easy thing to get a divorce, as I'm sure everybody's aware, um, you could find yourself effectively having lost everything that had gone into the, if you like, the joint pot. So that's couverture as a concept. Um, Femme sole. This is obviously derived initially from the French, but being English, we misspell it. This is basically an adult unmarried woman who is aged 21 and either single, divorced, or a widow. The crucial thing is, by whatever means she's unmarried, she has got a different position. She is not subject to coverture, and so she has got the right to own property and make contracts in her own name. But of course, that will be lost if she marries and she becomes a femme couverte. So I think the message here is, if you want to have control as a woman, don't get married. But of course, it's recognizing that the position of their daughters would be very difficult on marriage meant that fathers were very keen to ensure that the legal position was not as per the legal or the law would have it, in the absence of any intervention by them. And so the concept of the marriage settlements becomes quite crucial. And these, you tend to read about these in Trollope and just it can be quite blasé and just accept, oh yes, there's the settlements, and not really think about it. So what they are is in fact they're a trust established jointly by the parents of both bride and groom. So it's effectively looking at it from the not just the bride's side, the bride and the groom's parents are involved in this process. And basically, it takes the dowry from the father, uh, and in effect shelters it so that if the husband turns out to be a bounder, rotter, or cad, or any of the sort of numerous ways in which men could behave badly back then, um, uh, this protects the assets that the wife has brought um, into the marriage. And so the trustees are the legal owners of the assets. So these are assets that are not passed to the husband. Um, and the bride and groom are beneficial owners during their lifetime. So basically, they can go to the trustees and say, can we have a few thousand out of our trust, please, because we want to do this, that, or the other. And because the trustees are from both the parents of both the bride and the groom, it prevents the bride from being shafted financially by the groom by taking assets out of the trust. After their deaths, the beneficial ownership goes to their children. It doesn't have to go to all of them; it can go to one or more of them, and that will be part of the the actual wording of the trust to ensure that if there were entails and so on that they would want to maintain, then fine. The whole process behind this is to ensure that there's a proper use of the diary for these financial support of the bride throughout her married life and her widowhood, assuming that she outlived her husband. So it gave financial security to the bride. Um, and also, it enabled the bride's father to get a financial commitment from the groom's father um, uh, to support the marriage and any children that might come out of it. So it's that's the way by which the very weak position that the woman in a marriage would have under the principle of coverture was in effect watered down, or protection given to the wife from that. But that's all the legal position as it stood for much of Anthony's life until we get to the Married Women's Property Act of 1870. And this is where things start to change for the woman, so that she has more control. So basically, anything that she earns are no longer earnings that go to the husband. She keeps control of her earnings. They go to her and not to her husband. That can be money made from any employment. It can be from any use of any skill. So, for example, women authors were protected by this, and also any investments made with the money earned. So, it's definitely a step in the right direction. Um, it also deals with the inheritance of property. So, in effect, what the wife can now keep any property she inherits. So, if she were to benefit from under the will of her father, for example, she would be able to inherit property from her father. Um, and she can hold rented property in her own name and inherit that rented property, which becomes something points of interest when we look at the situation for Mary Bold after the death of her husband John. And it also provided that both parents are legally liable to maintain their children. Um, out of their separate properties. Um, this was a step in the right direction. In 1882 there was a second act which removed some of the common law doctrine of coverture, so that the women in married women were then able to own, buy, and sell her property, her separate property, without reference to her husband. Remember, up to this point, she could own the property but couldn't rent it out, sell it, or anything without her husband's consent. Um, Courts were then able to recognize the husband and wife as two separate legal entities. Um, Again, this is removing the concept of the wife being simply a part of the husband's legal entity, which has the interesting consequence that she can sue or be sued. And if she were to be sued, um, the she would be sued in her own right, and her husband would not be responsible for any damages that she had to pay. Also liable for their own debt, um, and were subject to bankruptcy, personal bankruptcy separately. So again, it's just emphasizing the gradual change to women after marriage having the same competencies, legal competencies, as they had as femsole prior to their marriage. So that's a shifting legal position for women during the course of Trollope's writing career, and it's interesting to read how women in later Trollope novels are more liberated by this than in the earlier novels. So that's the legal position. We also need to consider in a subject women and money, what the actual financial situation was in Victorian England. This is a macro view of the economic cycles. So it's basically showing how there are booms and busts over what are roughly 50-ish year cycles. So this is very, very macro. As you pass from periods of prosperity to recession to depression, and then it turns around and the cycle starts again. This has a strong relationship to the developments of industry. So you can see the first part of this is the boom in the coming through in the early part of the 19th century, so up to the 1815-ish, with industrialization of manufacturing with the steam engine, cotton, etc. And then the second boom comes around about the 1860s, with industry as we develop railways here in the UK ahead of other industrialized nations. So that's the macro position. The UK was at this in the 19th century a predominantly agricultural economy, and of course for many of Trollope's novels, we are focused on the landowning classes. So it's interesting to note that at the beginning of the century, so we're looking at 1809, 88% of British millionaires were landowners. By the end of this great period, beginning of the 100 years later, the outbreak of the First World War, only 33% British millionaires were landowners. So great shift away from having land as being the mark of if you like, the super rich in 19th century England to recognise that we're having industrial people coming in. And I'm sure we can all think of examples of that in Trollope's fiction. Critical things that occur. We have 1815. We have the Corn Laws enacted, then repealed 30 odd years later, which led to a fall in prices, which of course has a significant impact on the potential wealth of the landowning classes if agriculture is not getting good prices. But what happened was we had lots of nice profitable wars, in as much as having the Crimean War, the American Civil War in that sort of period, 1853 to 1862, creates massive increase in demand for the products of English agriculture, and hence supported prices. But then that's inevitably followed by a depression as we have excess production, and so we have grain prices falling massively in the final quarter of the 19th century. So owning land, as many of Trollope's significant characters do, you need to be aware of what part of the century you are looking at to see whether or not the people are owning land and it is a profit center for them, or whether it is becoming a problem for them. We're getting, I guess, fairly used to the idea of inflation again in the 21st century. I grew up in the 1970s when inflation was massive, 20% in some years. And so I'm very conscious of inflation. But had I been part of the 19th century, what you can actually see is at the start of the 19th century, price a pound worth a pound, 100%. Yeah. And by the end of Trollope's life in 1882, it's worth about 70 pence in decimal Plantagenet Palliser adjusted currency. And so what we're seeing is actually inflation is not a significant factor really in the budgeting, if you like, of the characters that Trollope writes about. There wouldn't therefore, given that we have basically cyclical sort of slight rises, slight falls in prices, similarly, you would therefore not expect to see significantly higher incomes needed at the end of the century than you would have needed when Trollope was born, to maintain the same sort of standard of living. What you can actually see, this shows the level of income. I'm fascinated when whenever I see a Trollope character, I see what they earn, and I having found this source, I now know where they sort of fit in the scale of things as earners. You can see that the vast majority of people earn, in 1851 they earn less than £400 per year. And as you can see, there are only measured in thousands the number of people paying Schedule E taxable income in the UK, even at that level. So the vast majority of the population is earning significantly lower than £200. For those who are not in the UK, Schedule E is our standard form of income tax in the UK for employed people. So you can see for the vast majority of a population that was measured in millions, were earning well less than £200 a year. And so when you see people earning, landowners talking about so many thousand a year as income, they are actually very, very wealthy. So their ability to squander that then becomes even more staggering. Which leads us on to our first example, Martha Dunstable. Very much a wealthy individual, appearing in the Barsetshire novels. And thinking back, this is she's in Dr. Thorne 1858 through to the Last Chronicle 1867, treating them as writing about more or less contemporary times. She is living, therefore, in the period of prosperity, when we think about our macroeconomic cycles. Uh, and she comes from, let's call it industrial marketing side of things with the ointment of Lebanon, which I think in her own view, um, comes fairly close to snake oil salesmanship in her product as something that is of any real, genuine value. So this is very much she is the beneficiary of the power of marketing. A business is described as being worth over £200,000, which is you can roughly multiply by 100 to get that value in today's money. So she's worth about a business. She owns a business worth about 20 million. So given what's just happening to the body shop here in the UK, and I don't know if outside the UK it's as well known, she was sort of the Anita Roddick of her day in many respects. She's about 30-ish when we first meet her in Dr. Thorne, and she's over 40 by the end of the Last Chronicle. So she's a very wealthy, middle-aged woman, middle age being 30 to 40 back then. So her 15,000 plus per annum puts her definitely amongst the super rich in terms of earners in her time. Massively, massively outside the scale of this graph. So she'd be one of people measured in tens or hundreds. At that sort of level of income. And what does she do with all of this money? Well, first of all, she's extravagant. So, and there are numerous examples of her. I'll just pick a couple. In Dr. Thorne, she in chapter 16, she described how she took a physician with her on her travels for the benefit of her health, whom she was generally forced to nurse. But the trouble it was to her to look after and wait upon her numerous servants. So she travelled with a physician. She's got a whole entourage that she takes with her, ostensibly for the benefit of her health, but in fact she ends up looking after them more than they look after her. So she accepts that as a given. And this continues. By the time of the Last Chronicle, in chapter 2, there's after she's married Dr. Thorne, no one saw so much company as the Thornes, or spent so much money in so pleasant a way. So she has her money and she makes use of it to for her own enjoyment. She's certainly cynical. Is the famous quote. I will repeat it from Dr. Thorne. Since she'd been brought out into the fashionable world, some one of her instructors in fashion had given her to understand that curls were not the thing. They'll always pass muster, Miss Dunstable had replied, when they're done up with banknotes. It may be therefore presumed that Miss Dunstable had a will of her own. So she knows that money and her money is uh, 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 is what people see in her. And she goes on to say, in Framley Parsonage, as it happens, nobody hates grandeur so much as I do. Of course, I must do as I'm told. I must live in a big house and have three footmen 6 feet high. I must have a coachman with a top heavy wig and horses so big that they frighten me. If I did not, I should be made out a lunatic and declared unable to manage my own affairs. But as for grandeur, I hate it. So, she's very conscious of the fact that her being super rich makes her very much, she sees the worst in people a lot of the time. Um, she doesn't take things seriously, though. In Dr. Thorne, it's noted Miss Dunstable, it must be acknowledged, was a little too fond of slang. Then a lady with her fortune and of her age may be fond of almost whatever she pleases. Uh, she can get away with things because she's a rich woman. And in Framley Parsonage, she makes fun of Mrs. Proudie, um, who kind of sucks up to her because she's rich. But she's also extremely astute or insightful, and of course, most of this comes out when she's fending off suitors, and over the course of several uh, 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 sections of Dr. Thorne, she's fending off one after another. Um, uh, so first of all, there's George de Courcy, and what she tells him, or she was already quite accustomed to being the target at which spendthrifts and the needy rich might shoot their arrows, accustomed to being so shot at, and tolerably accustomed to protect herself without making scene. So, as George de Courcy makes his play for her, she fends him off without causing offence. Gustavus Moffat also makes a play for her, and what we learn, and this is whilst he's supposedly engaged to Augusta Gresham, and so we hear that she was older than Mr. Moffat, and in spite of his 2 years of parliamentary experience, had perhaps more knowledge of the world with which she had to deal. But she listened to what he said with complacency, understood his object as well as she had that of his aristocratic rival, De Courcy, and was no whit offended, but groaned in her spirit as she thought of the wrongs of Augusta Gresham. So she's conscious that men will make a play for her, really in a quite cynical way, and she just accepts that is the way things are. She is a very um, big catch, and these spendthrifts need her money, and that's really all they're interested in. Um, Mr. Sowerby tries a different approach. On the advice of his sister, who tells him, tell her you propose to set yourself right by marrying her for the sake of her money. My own opinion is that your chance of success would not be bad. It's almost like Martha is so used to people trying to pretend that they're not marrying her for money that Sowerby is actually um, suggested that he just comes clean and says, I want your money. And she might actually be taken in by his candor. Um, but as is noted, there's a hardness about Miss Dunstable when matters of business were concerned, on which it seemed almost impossible to make any impression. She was so painfully resolute not to have dust thrown in her eyes. So when she's faced with a man who actually has come clean and says he wants her money. She looks at it much more as a business proposition, and in the end actually makes a better creditor than the Duke of Omnium. That's the old Duke of Omnium, for Mr. Sowerby. But is she happy? Um, she's enjoyed the company of Frank Gresham, um, but she thought that he was joking with her, and was not serious about her, and yet he still actually has to go through with making a play for her. Um, and she tells him, Mr. Gresham, if you make a fool of yourself, I shall come to the conclusion that you are all fools and that it is hopeless to look out for anyone worth caring for. Now, that makes me question, she's actually enjoyed Frank Gresham's company, and it's she's disappointed that he's actually gone through and made the proposal. Um, and so we get two big slow tears escape from her eyes and would have rolled down her rosy cheeks were it not that she brushed them off with the back of her hand. One cannot laugh with all the world against one. I think there is an underlying unhappiness about Martha in that respect. Her money is actually not a source of happiness for her. That said, she's got a sound moral compass. Um, that I think is she'd seen so much of the blacker side of human nature that blackness no longer startled her as it should do. That's from Framley Parsonage. Um, and she knew that she was hardly living as she should, that the wealth that she affected to despise was eating into the soundness of her character. She's conscious that having all this wealth is actually um, damaging her ability to be the sort of person she wishes to be. But she has attention to detail. She notices that when she's in a conversation about clergymen, we expect clergymen to do their duty, but don't give them a sufficient income. Is it not a scandal that an educated gentleman with a family should be made to work half his life for a pittance of £70 a year? Think of Mr. Crawley. And her advice to Lily Dale. Um, it's really she she has a way of seeing through to the heart of the matter, uh, and giving good advice to people when they need it. So I think she is, I think, a character who struggles with being very rich, and Trollope shows this, but shows her as a sympathetic character. Eleanor Harding, second example, married to John Bold, who was wealthy, and when he died, he left his widow in prosperous circumstances, as we found out at the beginning of Barchester Towers. And as is described in Framley Parsonage, she'd inherited property with belongings in land and funded money. So she's a rich widow when she marries Francis Arabin. And her level of income at about 1,000 a year puts her, again, she's in the very high earners in terms of income. Um, and so we need to think about what this can mean for her. Um, First of all, rather like Martha, she's actually wise about human relationships. Um, so in a conversation she has with her sister Susan about the daughter Griselda, who is looking to marry well, and Susan, the older sister, says, "I don't think there's any danger that her head will be turned." And Eleanor says, "I was thinking rather of her heart." Susan somewhat piqued at her younger sister's evident insight into the essential coldness and self-centered calculation of her daughter, urges Eleanor not to frighten Griselda with such concerns, to which Eleanor replies, I think that it would be almost difficult to frighten Griselda. That's from Framley Parsonage. Um, Eleanor clearly has an understanding of her niece Griselda and how cold and calculating she is. Um, Another thing that I found particularly interesting in the last chronicle um, was one. She takes her son John, John Bold's son, on a grand tour as he's coming of age, and that's obviously only something that the very wealthy can do, to spend time traveling in that way. Um, but also within this, of course, because she's away, she's actually passed an uncrossed check to Josiah Crawley, who's managed to forget that that was the source of the money, and ended up with being accused of theft and so on. And Dr. Arabin um, has compounded the problem by saying that they hadn't given him that money. Um, and in fact, Eleanor had simply done what she knew was perfectly possible to do as a businesswoman, that she can pass uncrossed checks to third parties like the Reverend Crawley, as if they were cash. It was as good as giving him cash. And Dr. Arabin was blissfully unaware of that in the way that he behaves and discusses that. So I think it's interesting that we have in Eleanor Harding a very astute woman who's better as a businesswoman than a rather unworldly husband. One thing that interests me, I think, is the psychology of people in respect of money. And so this is a very, very quick run through of how Trollope actually produces psychologically realistic portraits of people. There are various things that people are they are not sound in the way that they think about money. They cannot handle it effectively, and there are a number of psychological reasons behind that. One of these, they're listed here, but I think possibly the easiest thing to do is to give a couple of examples. Loss aversion. People make decisions because they're averse to losing money, when in fact they they're worrying about the wrong thing. So sunk costs, what money you've already put into something distorts your responses. So if you've already put a load of money into a particular project, you'll be reluctant to give it up. Um, Another loss aversion is people tend to view cash as safer than shares, even though for a lot of people, for a lot of the time, shares are in fact much safer as homes for their money than cash. And there may be people listening to me now thinking, what? That sounds stupid. But for long-term savings, shares are significantly better than cash. But people, because of loss aversion, do not see that. Um, they're also prone to inaction. You tend to overvalue what you've got, and so you are reluctant to put it at risk. You fail to take into consideration the time value of money. That's basically a pound now is worth more than a pound in a year's time is worth more than a pound in 10 years' time, because of the effects of inflation. So these various effects that Trollope makes good use of, which I've written about elsewhere. Um, But I thought we'd take a particular example, Lady Arabella Gresham, and look at see her psychology and see how that plays out um, in terms of does Trollope depict her psychologically realistically in the way that she is a bad money manager? Um, Bear in mind she's wife of Francis Gresham, Frank Gresham's father. She's sister of the Earl de Courcy, so she's top notch aristocracy. But the Greshambury estates are heavily encumbered, but not entailed. So basically, her husband's got into massive debt and mortgaged them, but they're not entailed. Now, how's he managed this in the golden age of English agriculture? This is the third quarter of the 19th century. Gresham income at that point was 14,000 per annum. So again, we're talking top 1% of UK income. Again, this is somebody completely off the scale, super rich, but has made a hash of financial decisions to the extent that um, he's had to sell one property, taken mortgages on much of the rest, and he's actually raising tenants' rents for the first time in 50 years by a third in Dr. Thorne. So remember, incomes are flat at this, inflation is flat at this point. So to have rents going up by 33% when incomes are flat it is a really significant indication of financial mismanagement on the part of Francis Gresham. So how does Arabella react to this? Well, she lives extravagantly. Greshambury Park, very extravagant. They've got a house in Portman Square for the London season. And they refurbish that and have an extended 10-week stay to facilitate trying to marry off the girls. So what we hear here in Dr. Thorne is that having received authority for a new drawing room carpet, had been made such dexterous use of that sanction that Arabella had run up an upholsterer's bill of £600 or £700, again multiplied by 100 to give yourself some idea of that in today's money. She had, of course, had her carriage and horses. The girls, of course, had gone out. It had been positively necessary to have a few friends in Portman Square, and altogether the 10 weeks had not been unpleasant and not inexpensive. So she is seriously extravagant. But in conversation with her sister-in-law, Rosina de Courcy, we hear from Rosina. I, for one, never approved of the hounds coming to Greshambury. That's another extravagance of Francis Gresham. When a man has once involved his property, i.e., mortgaged it, he should not incur any expenses that are not absolutely necessary. That is a golden rule which Mr. Gresham ought to have remembered. Does he gamble? The money, my dear, must go somewhere. What excuse does he give when you tell him you want this and that, all the common necessaries of life that you have always been used to? Girls cost nothing. There's only Frank. Can he be saving money to buy back Boxall Hill? So Rosina really doesn't understand. The Countess de Courcy really doesn't understand the true state of finances. I mean, yes, she's making good points about don't be extravagant with hounds, but girls cost nothing. We've just seen the extravagance that Lady Arabella's run through. Arabella says, he's not saving anything. He never did and never will save, though he's so stingy to me. He's hard pushed for money. I know that. So she does actually understand the financial situation. And so what they conclude is that, unsurprisingly, Frank has but one duty before him. He must marry money. So Arabella does understand the situation, but why is she so extravagant? Is she hiding her head in the sand? Or is it basically the sort of maintaining the facade to ensure that Frank presents well, and is then able to marry money without it being blindingly obvious that that's the only reason he's getting married. But why doesn't she do anything to avoid the the problems that she's making worse? Is it the endowment effect? Is it loss of aversion? Is it sunk costs? And of course, there's confirmation bias. She accepts the advice from her sister-in-law as to what to do, even though it's not good advice, because it plays to what she wants to hear. And so, as I say, confirmation bias. So I think that clearly indicates to me that Trollope's giving characters like Arabella Gresham as a woman facing financial issues, he's psychologically realistic in his portrayal of her, in a way that is where I mean the concepts that I'm using to describe what she's doing, the loss aversion, the sunk cost, the endowment effect. These are things from economics of the latter half of the 20th century, and Trollope's using them in the middle of the 19th century and using them correctly. He's not using the terminology, but he is showing it in action, as it were. And of course, we then get Arabella's final humiliating climb down when Mary Thorne becomes the rich heiress in Dr. Thorne. Lady Arabella's dreams flew away at once into the seventh heaven. Sordid as they certainly were, they were not absolutely selfish. She was actually looking for her son to be happy as well. But was she a hypocrite in so doing? I think she was, and I think Trollope thinks she was. Um, so, on to my final character. Opposite end of the scale, Mary Crawley, Josiah's wife. They're managing on something like £65 a year when they were in Cornwall, £130 a year when they were uh, moved into Barsetshire. And they're in debt primarily because of long illnesses from two of the children. Not that they are big debts, but small debts on such a small income are overwhelming. The Crawleys are one of the vast majority of people who earn significantly less than that £200 threshold for Schedule E tax. So even so, she had endured with him and on his behalf the miseries of poverty and the troubles of life, which had a life which had known no smiles. In all the terrible troubles of their life, her courage had been higher than his. The metal of which she was made had been tempered to a steel which is very rare and fine. That's from the Last Chronicles. Um, she, I find her character both moving and inspiring, much more so to me than Josiah Crawley. I find him very irritating. But what they managed it is through her ability to cut corners, as it were, cut her cloth according to her income. So from family parsonage, the amounts of butcher's meat and tea and butter, they of course were used in quantities which any artisan would have regarded as compatible only with demi-starvation. Better clothing for her children was necessary, and better clothing for her husband. As for her own raiment, the wives of few artisans would have been content to put up with Mrs. Crawley's best gown. The stuff of which it was made had been paid for by her mother when she had with much difficulty bestowed upon her daughter her modest wedding trousseau. She would have liked a new gown because it would have been useful, but it would have been nothing to her if all the county knew that the one in which she went to church had been turned 3 times. So I find it's really, really quite. She does all of this to support her husband, and yet what does he do? He berates her. When Lucy Robarts and Fanny give them some help, um, her reaction is that sort of shame is over with me. God has tried us with want, and for my children's sake, I am glad of such relief. It was hard, Mrs. Crawley said, to feel herself so different from the wives of other clergymen around her, to know that they lived softly, while she, with all the work of her hands and increasing struggle of her energies, could hardly manage to place wholesome food before her husband and children. And yet, he had often told her that she was without pride because she stooped to receive from others on his behalf and on behalf of her children things that were very needful and which she could not buy. He had told her that she was a beggar and that it was better to starve than to beg. She had borne the rebuke without a word in reply and then begged again for him and endured the starvation herself. She's realistic and she is, to my mind, an absolute saint compared to her husband, who to me is just an appalling man who has failed to recognize quite how his own wife is supporting him in his pride. So that is an example of a woman struggling with money in the Victorian era and Trollope's depiction of her. And on that rather downbeat note, I will end. Thank you.